questions you're probably all asking is, well, why are you talking about Miami when I'm in Jacksonville? Because we had a project in 2005 where that was the first time that the Jacksonville district had actually used confined underwater blasting as a construction technique in the continental United States. Also did a great deal of research and data development and publication in the peer-reviewed literature out of this project, and a lot of lessons learned that have now been incorporated and are being used nationally. We kind of set the standards for what everybody else is doing, and I seem to recall some folks that were down with us in Miami and said, well, if you can blast in Miami, you can blast anywhere. And I want to show you how that environment set the stage for what we might be doing here in Jacksonville. So I'm using Miami Harbor as a case study for you tonight. The issue that we had to deal with at Miami and carries through to Jacksonville is how does the Corps and our contractors meet a congressional mandate to deepen a port in an extremely environmentally sensitive area? How do we define environmentally sensitive? We had seagrasses, we had coral reefs directly offshore, we had a national park to the south of the project, we had the entire bay in which the port is located designated outstanding Florida waters. We also had a state aquatic preserve. We had a critical wildlife area directly to the south of the port. We had endangered, threatened, and protected species that call the port and the areas adjacent to the port home. And we had a highly aware citizenry and a city that overlooks the project site. Now, I think you can immediately begin to see some similarities between what we dealt with at Miami and what we may be dealing with here in Jacksonville. So, we first of all would start talking a little bit about the different construction techniques that we could use. One of the things here is that the rock hardness, so the substrate hardness, requires blasting in some areas. In Miami, there had been previous blasting and in South Florida in the early 1980s, and for the Miami Harbor project and the actual Miami Harbor that's getting ready to deepen this coming summer, we use something called confined blasting. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But this was developed with the blasting industry, but also looking at some safety radiuses that were adapted from the United States Navy. The Navy has these wonderful gentlemen that we refer to as the U.S. Navy SEALs. They do underwater warfare. They have a tendency to put explosives onto enemies' vessels. And then you've got to get that guy as far away from that bomb before it goes off so that he's not going to be injured. So we adopted their safety radiuses to protect our threatened and endangered species. So some of the other methods what we might look at for construction is a cutter head dredge. And I think you can see my laser up here. This is an example of a cutter head dredge. We might also use a clamshell dredge, exactly as it describes, looks like a clam closing. We might use a hopper dredge. This is an ocean-going vessel that sails around and basically drags two underwater vacuum cleaners alongside of it and sucks up sediment. Or we might use a bucket dredge, or you might refer to this as a backhoe if you've seen them on the side of the road. We use these in a marine environment. Now when we talk about blasting, the amount of blasting that we're looking at will be contractor dependent because different contractors have different kinds of equipment. One might have a very, very, very strong cutter head that can excavate 75% of the project without having to blast. Another one might have a strong backhoe that could do 55% of the project without having to blast. Unfortunately for the Army Corps of Engineers, there are these wonderful things known as federal laws that require us to give competition to industry. And we have to write our plans and specs such that we cannot sole source. So we have to write a specification that gives the most opportunity for competition amongst industry. And so, again, the amount of blasting may very well end up being contractor dependent, and then the equipment that that individual contractor chooses to bring. He may have a tool that could do it, but that tool could be in Australia. And he's not going to be able to get it back here in time to do the project. So he's going to have to use something else instead. So, some of the dredging equipment, like I said, is not going to require as much pre-treatment. That is the term that we use for blasting because what we're doing here is we're trying to crack the rock before dredging. We're trying to pre-treat it before dredging. And one of the other things we have to take a look at, and I'm giving you an example here from another port project that we're currently working on at Port Everglades, we look at the hardness of the rock that we're dealing with. And what they've done is our geotechnical folks have gone out with a core boring device and taken a core of the limestone rock, and they put it in this machine and they squeeze it. And this is called an unconfined compressive strength test. And they see how much pressure do I need to exert on this rock before this rock cracks. And what we see is right about 4,000 pounds per square inch is where we begin to talk about blasting, no blasting. Again, contractor equipment dependent. So At this point, I know there have been some core borings taken in Jacksonville, but not all of the ones that would be needed. A lot of that will be done during our planning, engineer, and design phase that Jason just mentioned, our plans and specs phase. So these kind of tests will be done at that point to even narrow it down more as to where would we be likely to blast in the Jacksonville project. Now, to give you some history, confined underwater blasting is not new in the United States. It has been used throughout the country, but the Jacksonville district was one of the pioneering districts to do it. We did it in San Juan Harbor in 2000. It was done up in Wilmington Harbor in 2002. For those of you that are familiar with the city of Wilmington, it overlooks their river with the 100-year-old structures right immediately adjacent to the river, and they were blasting right next to those structures. We did it in Miami Harbor in 2005, and it's been ongoing in New York Harbor since 2004. Additionally, these are just the East Coast projects. There was recently a project done in Columbia River as well out in the Portland district. Now, again, using Miami Harbor as an example today, when we did our original environmental impact statement in 1989, we estimated that there would be 250 blasting events required along this area here called Fisherman's Channel and the Dodge-Loomis Island Turning Basin to pre-treat the rock. So that's the number that we started with, was 250 based on a general review of all available industry in 1989. Now remember, we did the project in 2005, so a few things had changed. A little bit of technology, new equipment coming on board that we didn't have access to that information. So when you're you heard Jason just mention, well, we'll give the report to Congress and then it'll depend on when Congress funds it. So there may be new things coming on board, new technologies and things that we'll be able to take advantage of at Jacksonville that we don't yet know about. Now, this is the typical perception that people give me when I talk about blasting. How many of you have ever watched on AMC or TNT an old World War II movie where they're doing depth charges? Come on, your hands aren't glued to your side. This is an interactive presentation. Okay, so when I talk about blasting in the water, 95% of the people who I first meet go, oh my God, it's like a depth charge. No, it's not. So, this is not what we talk about when we talk about a confined blast. Actually, this is a ship shock of the USS Winston S. Churchill. The U.S. Navy, when they build a new class of ships, actually sets off a bomb next to the ship to see how well it does. Don't know if I'm comfortable with that, but hey, it's their boat. So, this is not what I'm talking about, though. What I'm talking about is confined explosions, and this is actually a 3,000-pound confined blast here on the left-hand side at Miami Harbor. And I want you to compare that to a 7-pound unconfined blast. And I know it's a little hard with the lights being this bright, but there's a buoy there, and there's a buoy there. Those buoys are approximately the same size. Now, how did I get 3,000 pounds to be that low and 7 pounds to be that high? That's what I'm going to tell you. That is confined blasting. So, confined underwater blasting can be used as a successful and efficient construction technique to pre-treat and crack hard rock, and do it with minimal impacts. Now let me tell you a little bit about confined underwater blasting and then the effects of blasting. So, when we talk about blasting, we talk about confined underwater blasting. The first thing that we do is we drill down into the rock that we're proposing to pre-treat. And we'll put the primer and the booster and the actual explosive charge, and then we're going to cap it. How many of you in here played with firecrackers as a kid? Okay? When you were holding those firecrackers, how many of your moms said, don't close your hand around the firecracker? Okay? Because you'd blow your fingers off, right? Believe it or not, that's what I want to do in confined underwater blasting. I want to put my firecracker in my hand, I want to close it around, and I want that pressure to stay in the rock, so when it fires off, I crack it. I'm going to crack the rock, and by putting that little cap right here, which is exemplified right here with this bag of stemming material, with the young lady holding it for scale, that reduces the pressure that escapes into the water and reduces that column of water going vertical by up to 90%, which improves the efficiency of the rock cracking, but oh, by the way, reduces all of the environmental impacts significantly as a result. Neat little side effect there. So, smaller impact area. We like confined underwater blasting. Now, the other thing we'll do is that you will see, this is a drill barge at Miami Harbor. This is the Miami Harbor port right here. You can see how close we are actually to the port. And they were drilling what we call a blast array. And here's a drawing of what a blast array might look like. This whole area would be considered one shot. But that shot is broken up into multiple small blasts, and those blasts are referred to as delays. We use the term delay because we break them up by a small little section of time in between each shot. And that time has to be greater than 8 milliseconds. Typically, in fact, our specifications require it to be no less than 15 milliseconds. Physics, being the wonderful thing that it is, says that if I put that much time between the two shots, I now have taken one big shot and broken it into two smaller. Or if I have multiple delays, I've put that time in there, I've broken that big shot into multiple small shots. So, the channel typically closes 15 minutes before a blast so that nobody's coming through, we don't have any boats or anything. After the shot goes off, we'll give it all clear. Now, one of the things you can see here in this lower drawing is these are actually the delays. So here's the delay number one. Number one's going to go off by himself. The number twos are going to go off together. The number threes are going to go off together. The number fours are going to go off together. And this is going to allow the rock to fall or crack in a certain way. And I've actually seen this done in quarry blasting where it looks like a loaf of bread as the rock falls. It's choop, 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 choop. So the blasters can actually cause the rock to fall and crack in a certain direction. Again, minimizing impacts to associated structures. So that's another beneficial side effect of using delays. Now, when I'm talking about protecting endangered threatened species, this is what I'm talking about. Now we're back to that Navy diver radius that I mentioned. And everybody remember that we're confining, we're reducing the pressure up to 90%. Then take that, throw it up, and water it away. Because when we talk about protecting species, we don't give ourselves any credit for that reduction. I want to be exceptionally conservative when I am dealing with species protected under the Endangered Species Act and or the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So what we end up doing, our drill boat would be, this is actually what we use at Miami Harbor. So in this case, I had an average delay weight of 90 pounds. And here's my drill barge. And I set up a group of zones. My inner zone is called the danger zone. And you can see the mathematical equation here for the danger zone. And we get the danger zone radius, and that's going to be the inner one. And with 90 pounds, if I plug 90 into that little pounds per delay, that W right there, that's where the W comes in, right here, pounds per delay, I end up with 1,278 feet. Now, that is the area in which if an animal were to be present, we would have a situation that we call a take. Now, it is not a lethal take, it is what we call harassment. Anybody ever been to a really loud concert, had a great time, and walked out afterwards going, I can't quite hear anything, my ears are ringing? Okay, that is actually what we would deem harassment for the purposes of a manatee or a turtle or a dolphin. We're going to make their ears ring if they're too close to the shot. So what do I want to do? I want to avoid that. To avoid that, I put another radius around that 500 feet further out. We call that the exclusion zone. And we set up a set of monitoring stations, and we're looking for animals. And if an animal enters the exclusion zone, we all get to sit and wait. I can't go cajole the animal out. I can't tease him out. I can't beg him. I can't feed, because those are all violations of federal law. So we all get to sit and wait for the animal to decide to leave of its own volition. After the animal has left, or after we haven't seen it for 30 minutes, and I bet you all of you just went, wait a minute, why 30 minutes? Because all of the animals I'm talking about are air-breathing animals. They have to come to the surface, and none of them can hold their breath for longer than about 25 minutes. So again, being conservative, giving myself a little bit of cushion there with 5 more minutes. Didn't see anything for 30 minutes. Now we can fire the blast. So we have another radius here. This is our safety radius. This is where we're going to monitor with boats. I'm going to show you that in a minute. And then we have our big watch area that we monitor with aircraft. Now, if you look at Miami Harbor, the one thing you'll notice is there's all this bay down here. Jacksonville doesn't have that. St. Johns River is this nice river that has banks on either side. So an animal is going to approach from the left, or the right, or the north, or the south, depending on where my drill barge is. And these animals all have to come to the surface again to be seen and noted. Remember, I showed you a project in New York Harbor. They had harbor porpoises in New York Harbor. They used this in Boston, again with harbor porpoises. Wilmington doesn't have really clear water. It's actually in a river, just like we're here in Jacksonville. It has the same kind of water clarity. Didn't have any problems. The animals all come to the surface. We keep track of them. Plus, they're very easy to see from the air as well. And in fact, Jacksonville University does a lot of manatee monitoring and dolphin monitoring from the air. So we know that methodology would work here in Jacksonville. So some of our monitoring methods. I mentioned aerial surveys with a helicopter. It's actually quite fun to sit in a helicopter with the doors off and pray the seatbelt holds as you're hanging out the side. Drill barge. We'll have 2 observers on the drill barge, one looking each direction. Then we'll have 2 small boats on the water on either side of the drill barge in that safety zone looking for animals. And they're communicating back and forth to each other by radio, as well as if we need to, we even go to red hand flags, so that if the radio fails, we don't have a reason to fire that shot until we fix the problem. One of the other things that we did for the first time at Miami Harbor, this was cutting edge stuff. We actually recorded the pressures in the water from a confined blast. This had never been done before. We had the information from unconfined blasts going all the way back to the 1940s. Remember, they were talking about how do we protect Navy divers. So the Loveless organization, the same gentleman that gave us the medical test for the space astronauts, did tests using monkeys and sheep and goats and various animals and subjecting them to unconfined blasts, because obviously you can't subject humans to it. But additionally, they actually pulled out data from World War II fighter pilots and gentlemen who were on ships that sank as munitions were going off in the water. Those gentlemen's bodies were exposed to pressure, and notations were made about what happened to them as this occurred. So they compiled all that data. We had a ton of data about unconfined blasting. We had 0 data about confined blasting. So as we went into Miami Harbor, there was some very interesting times for me. First of all, as a marine biologist walking in the door of the Corps of Engineers, I remember I'd been in the Corps 2 weeks. They assigned me this project. Ironically enough, my first job with the government was in Miami Harbor, writing down and tracking bottlenose dolphins. These were like my kids. I actually knew them by name, by sight, and here I was going to go down and allow somebody to blow up bombs next to them. Wait a minute. Fortunately for me, some of the project management staff in the Jacksonville district very quickly realized that they could not have me going out and go, you're going to kill everything. So they sent me to, of all places, for a biologist blasting school. And I joked with Dr. Konya earlier today, one of the only biologists I know who has a basic blast design certification. Thank you, Dr. Konya. But I had to learn that this actually is not what I thought it was. It's not that huge, impactful thing that we talked about. So, one of the things that I pushed for very, very heavily for Miami Harbor was we need to capture these lessons learned and be able to use them in the future. We need to capture this, and we need to report it, and we need to get it in the peer-reviewed literature. We need to fill that gap. So, one of the things here, we took pressure transducers and we set up an array of pressure transducers off of the drill barge, and we actually captured the pressure data from different distances and different depths. That allowed us to characterize what the blast looked like using an oscilloscope. You can see it right here. We also used hydrophones, just like if you've ever watched the Discovery Channel, you'll look at them lowering the hydrophone down. We use special hydrophones that can deal with the pressure changes, and we recorded those, and I'm actually going to play you one of the blasts underwater so you can hear what it sounds like in a little bit. But we recorded all of this data, took it, and I'll show you a little bit what kind of publications we used. One of the other things we did at Miami Harbor that will be, it's important in any blasting job, but it'll be just as important here in Jacksonville because we're an urban river, right, with people living and working right up near it, is seismic and vibration monitoring. In an urban environment like in Jacksonville, surrounded by commercial properties, utilities, residential communities, protection of structures is paramount. Well, once the areas of the project have, that it require blasting have been determined, critical structures within the blast zone will also be determined by our geotechnical team and with the contractor, and they will actually do a pre-blast survey and a post-blast survey. A couple of things that happened to us, one in Miami Harbor, there is a very, very large community of condominiums immediately south of the port. And we had a phone call one day from a lady who lived on Fisher Island, and she said, I'm really, really worried about my house. Can you come out and, put a monitoring device? I need to know what's going on. So a team went out and installed a seismograph. It's basically the same thing that you use for earthquake monitoring, for those of you that have ever heard about seismographs. And they were sitting in her house talking to her, and she finally said, guys, I gotta go. When's this thing gonna go off? And the geologist looked at her and said, well, it went off about 20 minutes ago. And he could see it on the seismograph, but it was so minor she couldn't feel it. And this was immediately adjacent to the blast. The other example that I'll use for you, for those of you that are familiar with San Juan, Puerto Rico, this is the El Morro Fort. It's on the headland right as you enter the port of San Juan. Here is the entrance channel right here. And the Park Service was extremely concerned about us blasting immediately adjacent to a 400-year-old fort. This is a national monument. It's not replaceable. And they said, yeah, we're really not happy. So again, what the contractor did with the Corps was they went in and found every crack in the stucco, and they took a photograph of it. And in some of them, they installed these crack monitoring devices to actually see if the cracks got bigger or longer. And they put an array of seismographs throughout the National Monument. And what was interesting was that once the blasting was all done, they were able to go back to the Park Service with the data and point out to them that A, the blasting hadn't had any effect on the fort, but oh, by the way, that big road with all those trucks driving by it every day was actually damaging the fort. This was something they didn't know about because nobody had ever thought to put a seismograph in the fort or an array of them and collect this kind of data. So again, protecting structures. So where vibration damage may occur, there are energy ratios and peak particle velocities that are set by local law and state law that require certain limitations, and the contractor has to meet those limitations as well. And you can see whichever the state or the county requirements, whichever is more stringent. So that is a requirement of our blasting code that I know our geotechnical folks and Dr. Konya can address a little bit more in detail if you have questions on that. Now, what I'm going to do, if I can get this thing to cooperate, is show you an actual recording of a blast from the surface, from the drill barge. This was August 2nd of 2005. This was 16 holes. Remember that array that I showed you? This was 16 holes. 67 pounds was the maximum weight of the delay, and there were 16 delays, and we had a total of 1,105 pounds of explosive.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, wow. That was kind of cool because you had like a squiggly pattern.
What I do want to also play for you, listen very carefully, you'll be able to hear the delays in the shot. Okay, I'm going to play it again. I want you to hear it and see if you can hear it go ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. Those are the delays. It's not boom, it's ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. And that is each of the delays firing off sequentially. Okay, so we talked about results. Again, we did a lot of monitoring. What kind of things did we see? We did 40 shots. Remember I said originally we had estimated 250. The contractor we brought in only needed 40 shots in 38 days to get the work done. The pre-treatment finished between June and August in 2005, blasting 6 days a week. Miami-Dade County Ordinance does not allow them to blast on Sunday, so Sunday was out. 186 animals observed, 58 of them were dolphins, 110 of them were manatees, 16 of them were turtles. We had 13 times that we had delays to ensure animal safety. 31% of those were dolphins and 31% of those were manatees, and ironically enough, our biggest issue was sea turtles. I guess we have actually a nice benefit here in Jacksonville that above River Mile 6 we don't have sea turtles. It's too fresh. So from River Mile 6 south or east, I'll have to worry about sea turtles. North of River Mile 6, it's actually too fresh. The sea turtles won't be there. So remove those guys at that point. And the average distance that we saw the animals from the array was 2,000 feet for dolphins, 3,500 feet for manatees, and 500 feet for sea turtles. So you can see sea turtles were closer typically to the array. And we believe that's because the sea turtles in the area are habituated to being in a port environment. The port is immediately adjacent to where they hang out. They're used to the ships, they're used to the people, they're used to the speedboats. So there's no reason for them to leave. Now, when we talk about the effects on marine mammals, if I use a 450-pound unconfined blast, remember I'm not giving myself any credit for confining the shot, and I look at the danger zone, we measured a maximum pressure at the edge of the danger zone of 23 pounds per square inch. And that was actually 700 feet from the blast. Do you remember how big I said the array was when we were looking at 1,278? So not even to the edge of the danger zone, and we get to our maximum pressure that we saw was 23. So if we get all the way to the edge of the danger zone, we're less than that. I mentioned earlier that we do have a situation if an animal is in the danger zone of having a harassment take. That is set forth by the National Marine Fisheries Service under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and they say the maximum threshold to have a take would be 22 psi. It's not lethal or injurious take, but it is harassment. So if an animal were inside the danger zone, we've just said that's a take, even though we know there's a buffer between the edge of the radius and 700 feet. The safety zone, which is further out, the maximum pressure was significantly less than 23 within the zone, and then take hold was 22. So we wouldn't have take, and we wouldn't have harassment. When we talk about fish, do I have any fishermen in the room? Okay, got some folks concerned about fish. I know I like to go fishing. If I'm talking about a fish with no swim bladder, like a shark or a ray, and I'll show you, here's a sawfish right here, these guys don't have swim bladders. The research tells us there's actually no effect on them, because the issue for animals is a change in pressure in a gas-bearing organ. So either we're talking ears for a person, or in the case of a manatee, they tend up with a lot of gas in their stomachs, or your lungs. Okay, these are gas-bearing organs. These are things that would expand and contract associated with those pressure waves passing over you. If you don't have a gas-bearing organ, like a shark and a ray doesn't, you don't have a problem on your hands. So, no effect to fishes without swim bladders. We're talking about a fish with a swim bladder, again, looking at the unconfined data that was in the literature, open water shot. There were 3 different studies that were done. One of them said, if you get to 14 psi, you start having issues. That's the one that is still currently used by the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Another study done in 1952 looked at a range between 40 and 70 psi. And a study done in 1995 by Dr. Tom Keevan said 50 psi. Now, ironically enough, if you get to a confined shot, 14 psi is what we saw in Miami Harbor, and that was Dr. Greg Kempen in 2008. So again, taking and answering questions that were previously unanswered. Here is the safety radius, again, for that 260W to the third for an unconfined blast. So if I'm trying to figure out the distance that I'm looking at for a confined shot where I might have fish injury or fish kill, 51. So it's 1/5 of what we would see in an unconfined shot. So the safe distance for fish at a 14 psi, which was the most conservative, remember on unconfined, from a 90-pound shot would be 1,148 feet. But Dr. Hempen was able to show that for a confined shot of the same weight, it's 570 feet. Fish within the 570-foot range would likely survive, considering the observations of both the Hubbs and Rickner paper and Dr. Keevan in 1995. One of the things that we did in Miami Harbor that we're doing again in the upcoming job and is sort of becoming standard is we put teams on boats after the shot who go in with nets and recover the fishes that do float to the surface. We can't go down and collect them on the bottom, but there actually was a team that went down to the bottom of Miami Harbor to see, well, how many fish are down there, and it was like about 5 or 6 during the whole shot, but we had about 20 on the surface. So if I look at the fish monitoring, we had, again, 40 shots between June and August of 2005, and we used something called a fish scare. Right before the shot goes off, we actually fire off a small firecracker under the water to try to scare the fish out of the area so that we have fewer fish closer to the shot, so again, lessen the impact. We had 23 of these shots monitored by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, where they were out there with boats picking up the fish. Our average number of fish was 14, and the maximum number of fish we had was 38. And most of these fish were small, scrolled filefish or cowfish. There were no commercially or recreationally targeted species like snook or tarpon or grouper that were recovered. Now, when we talk about invertebrates, particularly shrimp here up in Jacksonville, a literature review of the effects of open water blasts on invertebrates, including corals and arthropods would include shrimp. It was done by Drs. Keevan and Hempen in 1997. Looked at all of the available peer-reviewed literature on unconfined, remember the worst case, and said that the results of all the studies reviewed indicate that invertebrates are insensitive to pressure-related damage from underwater explosions. This may be due to the fact that all invertebrate species lack gas-containing organs. They don't have that organ to contract and expand and cause the issue, so hence they are insensitive. We have consulted with the National Marine Fishery on this for our upcoming Miami Harbor project for corals, and they have concurred with our determination. Now, one of the other things that we put together for Miami that we'll be using again in every project that we've done, because it really did set the standard, was a communication and coordination team. It was led by the Corps. We had the port and the local county, our contractor, their subcontractors, the federal resource agencies, the state resource agencies, the local county or city resource agencies, and non-governmental organizations. These are your environmental organizations. In the case of Jacksonville, Riverkeeper would be a good example to show you, a Sierra Club. One of the things that we did was we had a blasting workshop where we brought in experts to teach the resource agency staff about blasting. I can tell you from my copious amount of environmental education, biologists don't go to blasting school. It's not part of the regular biological training that we go through to become biologists. Dr. Koenig can well attest to, like I said, when I started the district, I said, you can't do this, you'll kill everything. Nobody ever sat me down and taught me about confined underwater blasting. Blasting workshop was also held for the public by the contractor. That is a requirement of our blasting specifications. So if blasting is used at Jacksonville, there will be at least one blasting workshop conducted by the contractor who will be doing the blasting here on the project. And we also arranged for visits to the work site by resource agencies and interested parties, including the press. The contractor that we had at Miami Harbor also created this flyer that they inserted into the Miami Herald. So every person who got a copy of the Miami Herald got a copy of this delivered to their doorstep in case they had any questions about blasting at Miami Harbor. We also had monthly meetings on site. They were held in Miami. Obviously, it was a more convenient location for most of our stakeholders. It was their backyard. We had conference call ability for those who were unable to travel. We reviewed our project progress and previewed upcoming events, and I think it made a huge difference for all parties. We maintained open communication lines between the agencies, the stakeholders, the contractors, and the Corps. I started to affectionately call them the good, bad, and ugly meetings, because we told everybody the good, the bad, and the ugly. What's going on, what's happened, what are we doing to fix it if we've had a problem. My project manager just loved putting me on a plane once a month, every month, to fly me to Miami. Now, one of the things I mentioned was that we worked to answer questions. Confined underwater blasting was a newer methodology to the resource agencies. They're familiar with military ordnance. They had been looking at military ordnance since some of them came into existence. The Navy and the Army are always out doing things with military ordnance. But here we were talking about this confined thing. As a result of the work that we did on phase 2, there is now a large database of information regarding confined blasting and allowed to successfully implement future confined blasting programs in equally sensitive areas. I mentioned the project in Portland that was completed in the Columbia River. They were blasting there with endangered salmon. Any of you familiar with what's going on in Columbia? There's a lot of endangered salmon species that use the Columbia River to get up into the mountains to breed. Those fish had to go right through the blasting zone. And so they were able to use a lot of our data to work with the agencies. We're working, obviously, I've been asked to help consult on the JAXPort. We are also working in Tampa, and we've been brought in by our Alaska district to work with them on the deepening of the Coast Guard station in Kodiak, Alaska. They got these cute little fuzzy little guys floating around out there who, obviously, they don't want to impact any endangered sea otters in Alaska, so they're asking us to come in and help them prepare public meetings, informational sessions. How did you guys do it in Jacksonville? You had manatees, you had dolphins, you had turtles. How do we do this? So again, lessons learned and paying it forward. And one of the things that I think I'm most proud of, because I jumped up and down, screamed, hollered, and stomped my feet a lot to make this happen, was we got published and did it in peer-reviewed literature and presentations. For the first time ever, we took the lessons learned from a project like this, wrote them up, and put them in scientific journals reviewed by our scientific peers. And put those papers out there, so now they're available to everybody. We went and presented at a variety of conferences. The Ocean Sciences Conference, there was a special session on acoustics, noise in the marine environment, and I was asked to present at that. We presented at the 15th and 16th Conference on the Biology of Marine Mammals. And again, we had a slew of articles and interviews, National Public Radio, Comcast Newsmakers, USA Today, Miami Herald, Jacksonville Times-Union, etc., trying to get the information out, not just to the blasting community, but to everybody else. Education is part of what I wanted to do with this, and I had to fight a little bit because that was sort of a new paradigm for the Corps. It's always been, we got the data, put it on the shelf, maybe we'll get to use it next time. And I said, we need to make this more public and get it out there, because either it's going to be easier next time or it's going to be harder next time. And what was really interesting was when we went to go get our permits for Miami Harbor for the one that's coming up this summer, our counterparts in the agency said, well, are you going to do it like you did the last one? And we said, well, of course we are. And they said, then we don't have any problems, which was a complete paradigm shift, because everybody was like, wait a minute, you don't have any, you're happy with that? You were, okay, so we don't need to change anything. So, the conclusion, confined underwater blasting, again, can be used as a construction technique to crack the rock with minimal impacts to marine organisms living in our project area when proper monitoring and safety precautions are established. And we have those protocols from the beginning of the project planning, which is why I've been asked to come in early on the Jacksonville Harbor project and get those protocols in as part of the supplemental EIS and any permitting packages. So that those are upfront considerations, not after the fact considerations.